As 31-year-old Nikki Vanderhayden leaned in close to the bathroom mirror and swiped mascara onto her lashes, she could hear her infant son laughing from the other room. She leaned back and peeked out of the doorway into her bedroom, where her boyfriend, 34-year-old Doug Dietrich, was playing peekaboo with their 7-month-old baby. Nikki smiled and then plugged in her curling iron. It had been a long time since she'd gotten dressed up for a big night out. But it was finally Friday, May 20th, 2016, and Nikki and Doug had tickets to see a rock band play at a bar in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Even though the couple had a baby together, this was actually kind of like their first big night out together. Nikki had met Doug less than a year and a half before. At the time, Nikki had just been divorced, and she had 2 young children from her previous marriage. She wasn't looking for a serious relationship, but Doug was tall and handsome, he worked at his family's very successful home building company, and he even owned his own house. And so they had gone on a few casual first dates, and just 1 month after they met, Nikki was pregnant. The baby was a total surprise, but Doug had been excited to become a father. He'd invited Nikki and her 2 children to move into his house, and he took care of all 3 of them during Nikki's pregnancy. And now they felt like a very cohesive and loving family of 5. But as much as Nikki loved her kids, she did really need a break sometimes. For the last 7 months, she felt like her life had really been consumed by caring for her children, working as a substitute teacher, and going to the gym to get back into shape. She and Doug barely got to spend any quality time together, and so she hoped this fun night out to this concert would help them connect. As Nikki wrapped a section of her long blonde hair around the curling iron, she heard the doorbell ring. Doug called to her from the bedroom and said he would go get it. A few moments later, Nikki's friend, Dallas Kennedy, rounded the corner into the bathroom. Dallas was tall and thin with long blonde hair and a lip ring. She'd offered to babysit that night so Nikki and Doug could go to this concert. Dallas asked Nikki where her 2 other children were, and Nikki said that their dad, her ex-husband, had taken them for the weekend, so Dallas would only have to look after the baby. Dallas said that made her job much easier, so that was great. Then Dallas left the bathroom so Doug could show her where to find the diapers and baby bottles and anything else she might need. Nikki finished doing her hair and then walked to her closet. As she did, Doug shouted from the other room that their friend and designated driver for the night, Greg, would be there to pick them up in just a minute. So Nikki quickly chose an outfit, got dressed, grabbed her purse, and rushed out towards the front door. Dallas was standing near the door with the baby, and as Nikki passed them by, she thanked Dallas again for babysitting, she gave her baby boy a kiss on the top of his head, and then she and Doug headed outside. 2 hours later, at 10 p.m., Nikki sat at a table in a neon-lit sports bar called The Watering Hole, watching a man play a drum solo on stage. The room was loud and quite packed, but Nikki had still managed to find a table that was big enough to fit her, Doug, Greg, and a few more of Doug's friends that they had met up with. Everybody was enjoying just chatting loudly over the music, but for Nikki, after spending 7 months basically stuck at home with a newborn baby, all she really wanted to do now was just get up and go dance. Nikki jumped up and skipped over to Doug, who was in the middle of a conversation with Greg, and asked him to dance with her. At first, Doug seemed reluctant, but he got up, took Nikki's hands, and led her out to the dance floor. The music was fast, with lots of percussion and electric guitar, and so Nikki and Doug jumped around until they were both out of breath. Then, Nikki just stopped and stood still and looked up at Doug with a huge smile on her face. Their relationship had really been such a whirlwind that they'd never really been able to let loose like this before. I mean, they barely even dated before Nikki was pregnant. Doug smiled back at Nikki and said he'd get them both another drink, and so he walked towards the bar. Nikki stood there for a moment in the middle of the room looking around, and she noticed a couple of guys checking her out. And for Nikki, who had not felt super attractive since she'd had her 3rd baby, this attention kind of felt good. But in reality, Nikki was not remotely interested in these random men. It was just the idea that they liked her that she liked. When she turned and saw Doug coming back towards her with a beer in each hand, she felt so lucky to have found such a handsome, caring, awesome guy. After another hour of drinking and dancing, the lights in the bar got brighter and the band left the stage, and Nikki felt disappointed that her big night out was already over. But then one of Doug's friends, named Angela Delphos, came up to her and asked if she wanted to go to a dive bar right down the street called the Sardine Can that had this big fake shark head hung on the wall behind the bar. Nikki laughed and said she definitely wanted to keep the party going. So she went over to Doug, who was sitting at the table across from Greg, and asked if he wanted to go to this Sardine Can bar. But Doug said he and Greg needed to finish talking about something, so Nikki should go ahead and they would just catch up with her in a few minutes. Nikki smiled and said okay, and then she headed out with Angela and the rest of the group. Once at the sardine can, Nikki got another drink and mingled with Doug's friends. But as time passed and Doug and Greg did not show up, she started getting kind of mad. This was supposed to be her and Doug's night out together, so why wasn't he here? Why was he prioritizing Greg? After waiting now for at least half an hour for Doug, who still had not shown up, Nikki sat down on a bar stool and somewhat angrily called Doug, but Doug didn't pick up. She texted him, and he didn't reply. Frustrated, she ended up finishing her drink and ordering another one. Angela sensed something was wrong with Nikki, so she came over and asked if she was okay. Nikki tried to temper her emotions, but she'd had a lot to drink and felt like her boyfriend had kind of abandoned her. She told Angela that Doug wasn't answering his phone, and she said it in a way that conveyed her frustration, and so Angela just said, okay, I'll try calling him myself. And when Angela called, Doug answered. And this made Nikki so mad. It was obvious what was going on. Doug was clearly purposefully ignoring Nikki. He wouldn't answer her phone calls, but he'd picked up Angela's right away. And for Nikki, the worst part was she just wasn't that surprised. She'd always felt like Doug had a wandering eye. They'd even had arguments about it before. And Nikki had told Doug that when she caught him clearly staring at other women, it made her question their relationship. And so Nikki just could not ignore the little voice in her head that said Doug was only with her because she'd gotten pregnant and they had a baby together. And so while Angela was still on the phone with Doug, Nikki sent Doug a very angry text message. Then she slammed the rest of her drink, stood up, and stormed out of the bar. She felt someone grab her arm and she spun around to see one of Doug's friends. He asked her what was going on and told her she should come back inside, but Nikki by this point was so drunk and so emotional and angry that she just started punching the guy's chest and telling him to leave her alone. The guy looked surprised, but he backed off and returned to the bar. Now alone on the sidewalk, Nikki considered going back to the watering hole where the concert had been and confronting Doug, but then she ultimately decided against it, and instead, she went in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, Nikki walked into a bar called Richard Cranium's. The place was dark and loud with multiple TVs playing different sports games. Nikki texted Doug again as she went up to the bar, took a seat, and ordered another drink. She kept her eyes on her phone for several minutes after sending this text, only looking up to thank the bartender when he brought her drink. Finally, when she did not get a response from Doug, she took a deep breath and just put her phone back in her purse. Nikki looked around, and just like at the first bar, she noticed there were a few random guys sort of checking her out. For a second, Nikki thought about going up and flirting with someone just to kind of spite Doug. But then, she saw the front door of this bar open, and she made eye contact with the person who walked inside. At the same time, across town at Nikki and Doug's house, the babysitter, Dallas Kennedy, was starting to nod off on the couch when she heard the front door unlock. It was almost 3 a.m., and she actually had not expected her friends to stay out this late, but she was going along with it. Doug stumbled into the house alone and obviously was very drunk, and Dallas immediately asked him, where's Nikki? And Doug just shrugged and mumbled that he didn't know. Dallas couldn't believe that Doug didn't make sure his girlfriend got home safe. So Dallas tried calling Nikki, but the call went straight to voicemail. Even though she felt really angry at Doug, she knew arguing with a drunk guy at 3 a.m. was not going to get her anywhere, so she gathered up her stuff and she left. When Dallas climbed into her car to drive home, she couldn't help but feel like something was just not right here. But she told herself that, she has no idea what really happened here. Maybe Doug and Nikki got in a fight or something, and, maybe Nikki's phone had died and she wound up crashing at a friend's house, who knows? But Dallas was certain that by tomorrow, whenever Nikki got up, she would certainly be in touch. The next morning, a farmer who lived about 2 miles away from where Doug and Nikki's house was, went out to his shed to check on some alfalfa seeds. He put them in water to soak a few hours ago, and now he wanted to see if they were ready to plant. But as he made his way towards the shed, the farmer saw his grandson and his grandson's friend sprinting towards him, and both boys looked absolutely terrified. They stopped in front of the shed, breathing heavily, and the farmer's grandson told him there was a dead body in the field. The farmer was so taken aback, he actually thought the boys might be messing with him. But he trudged out to the field anyway, and from a distance, he saw what he thought was maybe a deer's auburn coat. However, as he got closer, he realized it was obviously not a deer. It was a woman whose blonde hair looked red because it was now caked with blood. The farmer stopped in his tracks. He told the boys to go back home, and then he used his cell phone to call the sheriff's department. The county sheriff's office was less than a half-mile away from the farmer's land, so detectives Brian Slinger and Rick Lopnow got there in minutes. Slinger was a veteran detective with 18 years of experience, and Lopnow had handled his fair share of homicide cases. But as they both stood in the field over the body, they both felt a little shocked at the grisly scene. The victim was a woman who laid face down in the dirt, naked except for her socks. Her blonde hair was matted with blood, and the outline of a shoe was visible on her back, as if whoever had killed her had also stomped on her. And just the idea of that really made Detective Slinger's stomach churn. Slinger and Lopnow put on gloves, and they turned the woman's body over. Slinger saw bruises all over her body, and he noticed her fingernails were ragged and bloody as well. To him, this was a telltale sign that this woman had fought against her attacker. Then, Lopnow pointed to a dark purple mark circling the woman's neck. Both men agreed that it looked like she'd been strangled. Slinger could tell that this woman's final moments had been horrible, full of pain and horror, and even though it was too late to save her life, he promised himself that he would find who did this and bring them to justice. That afternoon at 4:30 p.m., a dispatcher at the county sheriff's office got a call from Doug Dietrich, who explained that he'd gone bar hopping with his girlfriend Nikki the night before, and she still had not come home, and so he said he wanted to report her missing. The dispatcher by this point already knew that a deceased woman had been found in the area that morning, but that information was not public yet. If the woman in the field was Doug's girlfriend, the dispatcher knew that he would likely be a person of interest in the investigation. So the dispatcher had to be careful not to reveal any details to Doug. So the dispatcher simply told Doug that a sheriff's deputy would come by his house at some point today to take his statement in person. And sure enough, a few minutes later, the deputy arrived outside of Doug's home wearing a body camera. The deputy knocked on the door, and when Doug answered, it was very obvious to the deputy that Doug was hungover. He had dark circles under his eyes, and he sort of cringed at the sunlight. Doug led the deputy into his kitchen, where they both sat down. Doug then repeated his story about going bar hopping the night before with his girlfriend Nikki, and then he said at some point he'd lost track of Nikki, maybe just before midnight, and at that point, the deputy asked why, if Doug had not seen his girlfriend since, midnight the night before, why did he wait until now, 4:30 p.m. the next day, to report her missing? That seems so reckless. Doug sort of hung his head and told the deputy that Nikki had gotten really mad at him last night, and so he figured she just needed some space and would come home eventually. So he hadn't gotten worried until this afternoon when it seemed like, no one had heard from her and she still wasn't home. The deputy thought this sounded pretty suspicious, but he nodded and asked Doug for a physical description of his girlfriend. Doug said Nikki had blonde hair and blue eyes, she was about average height, and she worked out a lot, so she had a very athletic build. The deputy told Doug they would start looking for Nikki immediately. Then the deputy went outside, got into his car, and called the dispatcher to let them know what Doug had said. The dispatcher, after hearing this, then called Detective Slinger, who was still out looking for evidence in the farmer's field, and she described to him Nikki's physical appearance. And Detective Slinger sounded somber as he said that physical description matched the deceased woman in the field to a T. The next day, Sunday, Detective Slinger sat in the county medical examiner's office, drinking cold coffee and waiting for the autopsy results. He hoped the medical examiner would find some helpful clues, because so far, a search of the farmer's field had not turned up anything useful. Slinger got a phone call from a patrol deputy, and when Slinger answered, the deputy began speaking a mile a minute. He told Slinger he'd been driving a couple miles away from the field, and right before he was about to merge onto the highway, he noticed something in the grass on the side of the road. And so kind of on a hunch, he pulled his car over to go look around, and he found multiple articles of blood-stained clothing. It looked like someone had tossed the clothes out of their car window right before getting onto the freeway. Slinger's heart raced as he realized this could be their first big break. He told the deputy he'd be right there, then he called his partner, Detective Lopnow, and told him to join him at the scene. A few minutes later, Slinger met Lopnow and the deputy on the side of a busy highway on-ramp. As cars rushed by, the deputy led the detectives through the grass and showed them the bloody clothing, which to this point the deputy had not touched at all. And so while Lopnow began taking pictures and bagging the clothes as evidence, Slinger began to walk around the area to see if he could find anything else. And before long, he stumbled on a purse. The detective put on a pair of gloves, then opened the purse up and looked inside. He saw there was a cell phone inside with a dead battery, and also a photo ID from the Green Bay Public School District for a pretty blonde woman named Nicole Vanderhayden. Slinger already had a strong feeling that the woman they found in the field was Doug's girlfriend Nikki, but now he knew for sure. It had to be her. He brought the purse to his partner, and Lopnow went ahead and packed it into an evidence bag. Lopnow said he would bring everything to the sheriff's office to be cataloged and then sent off to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab for analysis. Meanwhile, Slinger praised the deputy for his sharp eyes and told him what a huge discovery he'd made. Then Slinger jumped into his car and headed back to the medical examiner's office. By the time he got there, the autopsy was complete, and the medical examiner sat down with Slinger to discuss what he found. He told Slinger Nikki had likely died during the early morning of Saturday, May 21st, so just a few hours after Doug claimed he had last seen her. Nikki had suffered 2 potentially fatal injuries: blunt force trauma and ligature strangulation. In other words, whoever killed Nikki had severely beaten her and then used some kind of rope to strangle her. Either one could have killed her. Nikki had also been sexually assaulted, and defensive wounds on her hands showed that she'd fought against her attacker fiercely. Detective Slinger shook his head sadly. On the one hand, it was good that the autopsy revealed so much information, but it was horrible to think about how terrifying Nikki's final moments must have been as she slowly lost the fight for her life. The medical examiner said he'd removed Nikki's socks, and he'd also taken swabs from underneath her fingernails, hoping that between the socks and the swabs, that some or all of those items would contain a DNA profile from Nikki's killer. And he told Slinger he would send all of that to the state crime lab for analysis. Slinger thanked the medical examiner and headed back to the sheriff's office, where he found Detective Lopnow sitting at his desk looking very frustrated. Slinger asked him if everything was okay, and Lopnow said he'd just spoken to a representative from the state crime lab, and they were so backed up that they would only be able to accept a few pieces of evidence at a time. And so not only would the detectives have to pick and choose which items should be examined first, but it could take weeks or even months to get results. Lopnow couldn't believe that these bureaucratic delays could potentially derail their entire investigation. Detective Slinger was disappointed too, but he decided to move forward with old-fashioned detective work while they waited for the crime lab analysis. And that meant talking to literally everybody who'd gone out with Nikki on Friday night. Most importantly, talking to her boyfriend, Doug. On Sunday afternoon, the detective sat in an interview room with Doug, listening to his story about what happened on Friday night. Doug said that he and Nikki had gone to a concert at the Watering Hole, and then Nikki and a few other friends had gone to a different bar called the Sardine Can at 11 p.m. Doug explained that he and his friend Greg had stayed behind to finish their conversation and didn't show up to the Sardine Can until about an hour later, so after midnight. But by the time Doug got to the Sardine Can, Nikki was already gone. His friends told him that she'd left, so he figured she'd gone to a friend's house or something like that. Doug said that he and his friend Greg had stayed at the Sardine Can until 2:15 a.m., and then Greg dropped him off at home. Doug went to bed at 3, woke up at 6:45 to feed his baby, and then slept again until 11 a.m. After that, he stayed home all day waiting for his girlfriend to come home, and then when she didn't, he finally reported her missing at 4:30 that afternoon. Hearing Doug's story, Detective Slinger could not understand why Doug was not more worried when his girlfriend suddenly disappeared during their night out, and that made Slinger very suspicious. After all, Doug's alibi was not exactly airtight. Based on the medical examiner's findings, it was possible that Nikki was murdered after 3 a.m. on Saturday when Doug claimed to be home asleep by himself minus his baby. On top of all that, the detective already knew that Doug was not being completely truthful. Slinger had watched the body cam footage from that deputy who took Doug's missing person statement, and in that video, Doug said that Nikki had gotten really mad at him on Friday night, something Doug was not talking about now in this interview room. So Slinger pressed him about that. Doug admitted that Nikki had gotten really mad at him on Friday night because he had missed a few of her texts and calls, and then he had picked up a call from one of Nikki's friends, and Nikki was aware of that, and so Nikki obviously thought that Doug was ignoring her, but Doug said he really wasn't. It was just a misunderstanding. Detective Slinger was curious about these calls and text messages from Nikki, and so he asked Doug if he'd be willing to let investigators look at his cell phone data, and Doug said sure, and handed over his phone. Slinger left Doug alone in the interview room while he went to his office to review the messages. Starting after 11 p.m. on that Friday night, Nikki sent a string of very angry text messages accusing Doug of lying and cheating on her. She called him an abuser and said, quote, "You hurt me all the time," end quote. Reading this, the detective realized there must be a lot more going on in Doug and Nikki's relationship than met the eye. Slinger scrolled through a few more of Doug's text messages, and he saw that Doug had been messaging his mother about wanting to sell his house and end his relationship with Nikki. Doug told his mom he just was not cut out to be a family man. Sitting there in his office, staring at Doug's phone, the detective couldn't help but wonder, was Nikki just drunk and upset? Or was there truth to her accusations about Doug abusing her? And if Doug felt trapped in this relationship, how far would he go to get out? But before Detective Slinger could do anything else, he had to go tell Doug that Nikki was actually deceased. And so he got up, he went back into the interview room, and he just sat down and told Doug flat out that they were no longer looking for Nikki because she had been found and she was deceased. And Doug immediately broke down, began hyperventilating and crying and sobbing. He was inconsolable. And Detective Slinger just sat there and let Doug cry for a while, and then at some point, Detective Slinger got up and he left the room, unsure if Doug was the best actor in the world or if this was a genuine reaction. Regardless, he knew what he had to do next. Slinger went back to his office and downloaded all the information off of Doug's phone for his records, and then he began drafting a request for a search warrant to search Doug and Nikki's home. Later that day, Detective Slinger and Lopnow and a small team from the sheriff's office met at the big gray house where Doug and Nikki lived, armed with this new search warrant. They went inside and pored over every inch of the place. At first, everything seemed very neat and tidy, but then Slinger found a crumpled sweatshirt on the counter in one of the bathrooms. He picked it up and he noticed a few dark red stains on the front. Then Lopnow pointed to the bathroom trash can where 2 wadded-up bloody tissues were clearly visible right on top. The detectives bagged the sweatshirt and tissues as evidence, and just as they were about to leave the bathroom, Slinger noticed more drops of blood on the floor, leading to the shower. The detectives wondered if this might be where Doug came to clean up after he killed his girlfriend, but they couldn't jump to any conclusions quite yet, so they kept looking around, and eventually they went out to Doug and Nikki's garage, where they found Nikki's car. Lopnow peered into the car windows and immediately told Slinger to come look in the back seat. Even through the tinted windows, Slinger could easily see at least 2 dark brown stains on the seats, which he thought could be dried blood. He tried to open the door to get a better look, but the car was locked. Slinger began to walk around the car to try each door to see if they were open, but as soon as he crossed behind the vehicle, he just stopped, because right there on the cement floor, he saw a big dried blood stain. Suddenly, Slinger felt like he could see the crime playing out in his mind. He imagined Doug, drunk, coming home from the bar, and Nikki, also drunk, getting there a few minutes later, and then Nikki and Doug must have had some kind of fight in the garage, and the detective figured that Dougie killed her right there, where the big bloodstain was. Then Doug would have put Nikki's body in the backseat of the car, which would explain the bloodstains there, before dumping her body in that field and then disposing of her clothes and purse on the side of the road. After that, Doug must have come home and cleaned up in the bathroom, where they found the bloody sweatshirt and tissues. But Slinger knew this theory left one key question unanswered. How did Nikki get home from the bar? She didn't have her car that night, and the area where she and Doug went bar hopping was more than 12 miles away. And if Doug was telling the truth about coming home without her, then somebody else must have driven her there. Just then, the detectives heard someone pounding on the front door. They went through the house, opened up the door, and saw an older man standing on the porch looking totally freaked out. He held 2 pieces of a broken phone charger up in the air. Slinger asked the man what was going on, and he said he'd been mowing his lawn, which was just next door, when his mower had hit something and malfunctioned. He turned off the mower and flipped it over, and wrapped around the blades was this phone charger. But as he worked the cord out of his lawnmower, he realized there was some sticky red liquid on it that came off onto his hands, and when he smelled the red liquid, it had that coppery scent of blood. The neighbor said he knew the police were investigating Nikki's disappearance, and he wondered if maybe this phone charger could be some kind of evidence. The detectives asked the man to show them exactly where he'd been when the cord stopped his lawnmower, and the neighbor led them to the line right between his yard and Doug and Nikki's yard. The detectives began looking around in that area, and in the green grass, they noticed there were a few chunks of blonde hair. Then Lopnow pointed out 3 medium-sized bloodstains on the curb. Clearly, Slinger thought, his earlier theory had been wrong. Nikki had not been murdered in the garage, she'd been killed right there in the street in the middle of the night, and Slinger felt sure the killer had used that phone charger to strangle her. The detectives thanked the neighbor, then they took the phone charger and also the hair in the yard as evidence, and they took pictures and swabs of the bloodstains in the car, garage, and on the curb. They would ship all of it to the state crime lab for analysis as soon as possible. But even before those results came back, Detective Slinger felt like they already had probable cause to arrest Doug and at least hold him in jail. So they got an arrest warrant, and officers brought Doug into custody on Monday, May 23rd, just 2 days after Nikki's murder. Handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser, Doug cried and wailed and hyperventilated and told officers that they really had all of this wrong. But Detective Slinger didn't think so. All he had to do now was wait for the crime lab analysis to prove it. Over the next few weeks, results from the backlogged state crime lab slowly trickled in. And then, in early June, Detective Slinger got a call from an analyst at the lab who said they had just made a huge discovery. They'd found a partial male DNA profile on Nikki's body, and the same partial profile had been found on that phone charger that they all assumed at this point was used to strangle Nikki. Slinger was ecstatic. He knew a partial profile could not actually be used to definitively link a suspect to a crime, but it was enough evidence to rule suspects out. He figured if this partial profile matched Doug's DNA, well, that was just one more reason to really feel certain that Doug was guilty. So the detective got a DNA sample from Doug, who was still being held in the county jail, and they sent it to be compared with this partial profile. And when Slinger got the results, he was shocked to see that Doug's DNA was actually not a match. To Detective Slinger, this didn't make any sense. There was blood all over Doug's house and yard, and yet the DNA analysis showed that a completely different man had grappled with Nikki in the moments leading up to her death. Slinger walked down the hallway to Lopnow's office and told him about the confusing DNA results. The detectives talked through the timeline they'd made of Nikki's final hours to see if there was maybe some other man in the mix that they could have missed. And that's when they realized something they'd glossed over. On Friday night, when Nikki and her friends went to the second bar, Doug stayed behind at the first bar with one other person, his friend Greg, the designated driver who picked Nikki and Doug up and who was supposed to take them both home. And so Slinger wondered if maybe Greg could have been Doug's co-conspirator. Maybe he was the one who drove Nikki home, and maybe he helped Doug pull off the crime. But that was only speculation. Right now, the sheriff's office didn't have any proof. They did have multiple bloodstains from in and around Doug's house, but they were still waiting for more results from the crime lab to know whose blood it was. And Lopnow said they couldn't keep holding Doug in jail much longer because Doug's DNA was not on Nikki's body. Slinger knew his partner was right. Much to his disappointment, Doug was released from jail on June 10th, almost 3 weeks after Nikki's murder. 10 more weeks would pass with no breakthroughs, and every day, Detective Slinger felt haunted by the knowledge that a killer was right now walking free. Then, in August, 3 months after Nikki's death, the detective got another call from the state crime lab. They'd found a male DNA profile on one of Nikki's socks, and this profile was complete. Slinger submitted the profile to the FBI's National DNA Database, and right away he got a match. Finally, after months of investigation, he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt who the murderer was. Based on the DNA results, along with interviews, cell phone records, and security footage, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Vanderheyden in the early morning hours of Saturday, May 21st, 2016. Just after midnight, the killer strode down the sidewalk in downtown Green Bay, then entered a bar called Richard Cranium's. As soon as he walked in, the killer made eye contact with Nikki, who was sitting on a bar stool across the room. She looked drunk and sad. The killer approached her, sat down, and asked if she wanted to talk. They chatted for a while, and as they did, Nikki's mood began to improve. The killer offered to buy her another drink, but Nikki said no, she'd had more than enough, and she just wanted to go home. So the killer asked if Nikki wanted a ride, and she nodded her head. At about 12:30 a.m., the killer helped Nikki stumble out of Richard Cranium's, then opened the door for her to get into the passenger seat of his car. As they drove away, the killer noticed that Nikki was nodding off. She looked vulnerable, and the killer saw this as an opportunity. Instead of taking Nikki home, the killer drove her to his house. When the car rolled to a stop, Nikki stirred, looked around, and asked what was going on. The killer put a hand on her leg and asked if she wanted to come inside, and she immediately recoiled and said no way. She said she didn't even understand why he would ask that because he knew she had a boyfriend. The killer pulled his hand back and said, okay, that was fine, but inside, he felt shocked and embarrassed by this rejection. And so as he turned around and began driving towards Nikki's house, inside he was burning up and getting more and more upset, and by the time he got to her house, he decided he was not going to take her no for an answer. He parked outside of Nikki's house and promptly locked all the car doors. Then he reached across the middle console and literally began pulling off Nikki's clothes, and she tried to push him away, but he was a lot bigger than she was. After her clothes were taken off, the killer sexually assaulted Nikki. After the assault was over, Nikki managed to get the door unlocked and jump out of the car. The killer realized that if she got away, she would tell people what had just happened. So the killer jumped out of the driver's seat and grabbed Nikki. And they fought viciously right on the street beside the curb. The killer punched Nikki and tore out chunks of her hair, and Nikki clawed at her killer so hard that her fingernails broke off. Eventually, the killer pushed Nikki down in the street and stomped on her back. As Nikki struggled to get back up, now gravely wounded, the killer ran to his car and grabbed a phone charger. Then he ran back to Nikki, wrapped the cord around Nikki's neck, and strangled her to death. The killer stood upright, breathing heavily. The weight of what he'd just done came crashing down on him, and he looked around, terrified that somebody in the neighborhood had been watching. But the street was dark and quiet. So the killer lifted Nikki's lifeless body into the backseat of his car, and he drove off. As he made his way out of Nikki's neighborhood, the killer noticed a big plot of empty farmland right off of a main road. Without thinking, he pulled over, took Nikki's body out of the back seat, and carried her far enough into the field that nobody would see her from the street. Then, after dumping her in the field, the killer ran back to his car. But just as he was about to get on the highway, he realized he'd forgotten something. Nikki's clothes and purse were still in the car. So, as he was driving, he rolled down the passenger side window and threw the items towards the side of the road before merging onto the freeway. After that, the killer rolled the window back up and tried to steady his breathing. He told himself everything would be okay, nobody would find out what he did. He repeated this to himself over and over until he believed it, and then he just continued on with his life as if nothing had happened. But 3 months later, in August of 2016, the state crime lab finally found the killer's DNA on one of Nikki's socks. Detective Slinger entered the profile into the FBI's national database, and he found a very surprising match. The DNA did not belong to Doug or Doug's friend Greg. In fact, the DNA didn't belong to anybody that Slinger had even heard of. The profile matched a man named George Birch. Police would eventually learn that George was 38 years old, he was 6 foot 7 inches tall, and he had moved to Green Bay from Virginia just 2 months before Nikki's murder. Through national law enforcement records, Detective Slinger discovered that George had a long criminal history, including charges for burglary, possession of a concealed weapon by a felon, drunk driving, and grand larceny. He'd also been investigated by the Green Bay Police Department for potential involvement in a hit-and-run accident in June of 2016. As part of their investigation, the Green Bay Police accessed all of George's cell phone records, including text messages and internet browsing history. Slinger discovered that in the days after Nikki's murder, George Googled her case 64 times. On top of that, GPS data from George's phone gave detectives a map of his movements on the night Nikki was killed. George entered Richard Cranium's bar just after midnight. He left at about 12:30 a.m. and then drove to his house, then Nikki's house, then the field where Nikki's body was found, and finally to the road where her clothes and purse were discovered. The state crime lab eventually found George's DNA all over Nikki's body, on her clothes, and on the phone charger that George used to strangle her. The evidence against Nikki's boyfriend, Doug, did seem strong, especially all that blood, but the lab analysis showed that it was misleading. It turned out the bloody sweatshirt and tissues in Doug and Nikki's bathroom belonged to Nikki's sister, who'd had a nosebleed. The stains in Nikki's car were blood, but the lab determined it came from one of her older kids. And the big dried puddle in the garage, well, it wasn't even human blood. It was actually turkey blood because Doug had gone hunting and killed a turkey. And so, of course, this turn in the case was not what the detectives had expected, but the evidence against George was overwhelming. And so, George was arrested, and Doug was fully exonerated. George Birch was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. George attempted to appeal his conviction in 2021, but it was denied. After Nikki's murder, Doug would raise the baby boy that he had had with Nikki, and Nikki's ex-husband cared for their 2 older children. The Green Bay community also held a fundraiser to collect money for all 3 kids, who now must grow up without their mother. One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and 2-year-old daughter down for their naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids fell asleep, Tabby looked over at the clock. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his job as a high school teacher, and he was running late. Tabby wondered, what could be holding up her husband, and she certainly hoped he was okay, but she couldn't just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they didn't own a landline phone. They literally didn't have enough money to afford a landline phone in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet. So Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers. But they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had gotten a few stories published here and there, but, for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. Tabby was home with the kids, and then in the evening would work some shifts at a Dunkin' Donuts, and then her husband, in addition to being a teacher, also worked at a laundromat. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that, maybe one day she could break in and be a professional writer and have that be her primary income. But her husband, who also, had the same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunity to, one day just be a writer. He sort of felt like this truly was impossible, that they'd struggle forever and he wouldn't become a writer. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to the dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the table, were all these empty beer cans and food wrappers and rejection letters from various magazines and publications, and the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag to take it outside, but as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it, that were typed on this paper. And as soon as she did, she stopped because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before, like this was different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this before, and so she was curious. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off, and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away, and she couldn't believe how good it was. And so it dawned on Tabby that clearly her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder, one, why are you doing that? Why are you hiding this particular thing from me when you let me read everything else? And 2, again, this is so good, why is it crumpled up and in the trash? Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband and she was like, "What is this? Why haven't you shown me this?" And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, "No, this is so good, what's going on here?" And her husband would tell her, "Look, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter, and, I'm just not talented enough to finish the story, and even if I was, this is too weird, it's too out there, no one would publish this." And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on making money for the family, something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, "No,
This is the one. This is the one that's going to help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You gotta see it through. It's too good not to. And so, at Tabby's insistence, that's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was gonna react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance, which in today's money is $2.5 million. A massive, massive book deal by any standard. And so the young couple was totally thrilled. They took the book deal, the book got published, and with the money they got, they were able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone. But that was only the beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a good one, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story that Tabby saved from the trash can would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King.
Our next story is called Accidental Superstar. In 1964, during his final semester of college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to take an acting class. He believed it would be an easy A, and he'd always been pretty shy, and so he figured this class might be able to help him get over that. But this class wound up having a much larger impact on Harry's life than he ever could have imagined. Not only did he meet his future wife in this class, but he also realized he loved acting. Something he never thought he would like, and he decided after college that that was the thing he was going to pursue. And so after he graduates later that year, he and his girlfriend get married, and then they fly out to Hollywood, California, where Harry auditions for Columbia Pictures' New Talent Program, which is basically this program that's designed to help new actors and actresses get parts in Hollywood because it's so hard to do that. And so he's accepted into this program, he signs a contract with them that pays him almost nothing, and right away they start shopping him around for different parts in TV shows and movies, but nobody is interested in Harry. Nobody. The only roles he was getting were incredibly minor and usually non-speaking, and so it was really not advancing his career. Then, in 1966, so 2 years after he and his wife had arrived in Hollywood, Harry received what seemed like his first big break. He was offered a speaking role in a movie, although it was a very minor role. It was a 60-second bit where Harry basically walked on screen in this hotel, and he started calling out for a particular guest. And when he finds this guest, he walks up and gives him a piece of paper, and then he leaves. So it's a forgettable scene, but it's a real scene in a real movie, and so this was a big deal for Harry. And so after Harry goes over to the studio and he films this whole scene and it's all done, he goes back over to the headquarters of the New Talent Program at Columbia Pictures. And as soon as he goes inside, one of the producers that was in charge of this New Talent Program, who had apparently had a chance already to see this 60-second scene in this movie that Harry was in, he calls Harry over and asks him to go up to his office for a second. So the pair go up to his office, they both sit down, and the guy looks at him and says, "Look, I just gotta shoot you straight here. You're not gonna make it in Hollywood. You're not gonna be a movie star." When Tony Curtis was told to carry groceries across this room in one of his first movies, everybody knew right away as he's carrying those groceries that guy, he's gonna be a movie star. You could see it in the scene, even though all he was doing was carrying groceries. And when you did your scene as the bellhop walking around the hotel, I just didn't see it. You don't have the X factor. You're not going to be a movie star. For reference, Tony Curtis, the guy this producer was referencing, was a huge movie star in the 1950s and 1960s. And so Harry, after getting this horrible comment made about him, he pauses for a second, and then he leans across the table and looks at this producer and squints his eyes and says, "You know, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star?" And at this totally smart aleck remark, the producer fired Harry on the spot. Harry would go on to sign a similar new talent program deal with Universal Studios, but again, he could not get a real part to save his life. And the feedback he finally got was, Harry, you're just not pretty enough, and you're not really that talented. By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s, and while he still aspired to be an actor and wanted to be an actor, he was making almost no money from acting. And so he decided, instead of acting, he was going to become a carpenter. That was going to be his full-time job. Despite the fact he knew nothing about carpentry. And so he literally, just because he has this interest in carpentry, goes to the library and checks out all these how to be a carpenter books. And over the next couple of weeks, he studies these books and does a couple projects around his own house. And then finally, he just felt confident enough, or he was just desperate enough for money, that he began going around to his network and asking people in Hollywood if they needed some woodworking, if they needed help from a carpenter. And surprisingly, lots of people took him up on his offer and they hired him to be their carpenter. And before long, Harry was dubbed the Carpenter to the Stars, which was kind of ironic because he actually was not a very good carpenter, and he was regularly seen on the job, literally holding a book, teaching him how to be a carpenter while doing the carpentry with his other hand. In 1976, Harry was a full-fledged carpenter and had been for about a year when one of his very close friends named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, gave him a call and told him he had a very unique opportunity for him. Now, at this point, Harry was not looking for any more acting roles. He kind of figured that ship has sailed, even though he wishes he could be an actor. At this point, he had a wife, he had 2 sons, and so he's thinking, I gotta just keep doing this carpentry thing because I gotta pay the bills. So he says to Fred, I appreciate the offer of whatever this is, but if it has to do with acting, I'm just not interested. And Fred, who was one of the very few people in Hollywood who fundamentally believed Harry was destined to be a star, told Harry, no, this is different. This is not a pure go out and try out for the part and hope for the best. This is like, put yourself in a good position and maybe somebody will discover you're as talented as you really are. And so Harry's like, okay, tell me about this opportunity, I'm interested. And so Fred explained there was this really talented and eccentric film director who was trying to cast an upcoming movie. And the way he went about casting for movies was a little bit strange. Instead of having each of the actors and actresses show up and individually audition for their parts, he would group batches of actors and actresses and he would have them audition as a group, because that way he could tell if there was chemistry amongst some of the actors and actresses and he could gauge their individual talent. And so he had all these groups already planned out, but one of the groups was missing one male actor. Somebody had dropped out at the last minute and was not going to be there on the day of the audition. And so when Fred Roos heard through the grapevine that this director was going to be short this one person, he immediately reached out to the director and said, hey, I got your guy. There's this guy, Harry. He's done a little bit of acting. He's incredibly talented. You got to give him a chance. At the minimum, he can come in there and he can at least just read the lines and help you do this audition. But I know he's available that day and I know he would love to help. And so this director tells Fred, okay, thank you. I'd love to have him come down, but stress to him, he is not auditioning for any part in this movie. I'm not bringing in some person and just throwing them in. It takes me a long time to find people that I want to audition, and he is not one of them. He is just there to facilitate the audition. He's just going to read the lines so the other people in his group can do their audition. And so after Fred stopped explaining this situation, Harry was actually kind of annoyed. He was annoyed that Fred had basically already volunteered him, and so he couldn't really even say no without making Fred look bad. And he didn't like the idea that this was basically a waste of his time. He was being asked to go read lines, but not even try out. So how was this even an opportunity? But Fred told him, look, worst case scenario, you meet some pretty powerful people in Hollywood. This director's a big deal. The people there are going to be big deals in Hollywood. So you'll meet them and maybe they will recognize your talent. Or maybe you get some new clients for your carpentry business. So no matter what, you get something out of it. And so finally, Harry says, okay, fine, I'll go do this thing. And so Harry goes to this audition, he's handed the script, and he's reminded repeatedly to not attempt to audition. Don't try to act, just read the lines. I don't care if you're monotone, you just read these lines because you're not auditioning. Everybody else is, you're not. Is that clear? And Harry's like, yes, I get it. I'm just reading the lines. And so Harry sits down and he starts reading the lines and he's trying to do what they told him to do, but the way he was actually feeling and his actual personality began seeping through. he started coming off as this really grumpy and sarcastic guy that just didn't care about anybody there. He was just totally bitter that he was in the situation he was in. And apparently, this is exactly what the director was looking for in one of the characters he was trying to cast. That kind of nonchalant, bravado, macho, alpha type guy who just didn't care about anybody. And so over the course of the day, as he's reading the script over and over again, not caring at all about how he's performing, he's just simply reading these lines and just being himself, he was actually doing this amazing job portraying one of the characters. And so they let Harry go the whole day. No one told him they were looking at him as a potential character. And then at the end of the day, when Harry was about to just throw the script in the trash and leave without talking to anyone, the film director, better known as George Lucas, walks up to Harry, better known as Harrison Ford, and says, "Wait a minute, I was wrong. You are perfect for this movie, Star Wars. You need to play Han Solo." And so Harrison Ford said, "All right, I'll play Han Solo." And that role as Han Solo propelled Harrison Ford into the megastar that we know him as today. A few years after Harrison had starred in Star Wars and he was this total A-list celebrity, he was at a Hollywood studio in one of their restaurants when one of the waiters walked over to him with the silver tray, and on this silver tray was a single business card. So Harrison reaches over, he grabs the business card, the waiter walks away, and he looks at the card, and handwritten on it is the phrase, "I missed my bet." And he flipped the card over, and it was the name of that producer from the New Talent program that had called Harry into his office and said, "You're never going to make it in Hollywood and you're fired." It was that guy, and he had apparently sent the waiter over to make amends because he was eating lunch in the same restaurant. And so Harrison would later say in interviews that at the time he got this card, and to this day that he was doing this interview, he said it gave him immense pleasure that when he looked up from this business card and he understood the situation, he knows this guy's in the room somewhere. As he looked around the room, he couldn't recognize the guy because he didn't know what he looked like. He was a nobody. And so instead of wasting any more time looking for this producer, he just looked at the card, chucked it, and went back to eating his lunch. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Shiner. One night in 2009, a 23-year-old man named Chris, along with his date, walked into a McDonald's in London, England. The following day, Chris had a very important job interview in the morning, and so this dinner in McDonald's was going to be the last part of the date. There were no plans beyond this. This McDonald's was dirty, it was loud, it was packed with people, so not exactly a romantic location for a date, but this was all Chris could afford. In fact, he really needed that job the next day because he just didn't have much money. But for now, this was the best he could do, and so he put on, his best smile and looked at his date like, "Is this okay?" And she kind of looked back and smiled like, "I get it, it's fine, we can eat here." So they hopped in line and they waited, finally got to the counter, they ordered their food and their drinks, and then after receiving them, they turned around and looked for a place to sit down. But as they looked around, they saw every table was taken, literally every one. And so Chris and his date began looking for tables where, there were at least a couple of empty seats. Maybe somebody was sitting there, but they might allow Chris and his date to sit with them. And so they began walking around, and eventually they would find a table where there was just this one guy sitting there. He was sort of minding his own business, just eating his meal. He was not taking up the whole table. And critically, there were 2 seats at this table that were unused. And so Chris kind of tapped his date and pointed to the table, and then the 2 of them walked over, and Chris very politely asked this guy, "Hey, would you mind if we sat here too? We won't bother you. We're just gonna eat and we're gonna get out of here." And the guy just kind of looked at him and he was like, "Sure, go ahead." And so Chris and his date, they sat down and they began eating and chatting, and it was all fine. But as they were eating and chatting, his mind kept going to the next day. He had that big job interview the next morning, and it was just really the only thing he could think about. In fact, he tried hard to focus on his date, but he was just so anxious about this interview that he just couldn't. And so he found himself not really eating and just kind of waiting for the date to be over so he could just go home, go to bed, and, focus on tomorrow. But as he's sort of distracted and his date's chatting about whatever she's chatting about, he realizes the guy they're sitting with is no longer just looking at his food. He stopped looking at his food and he's just staring across the table at Chris's date. And the way he's looking at the date does not seem friendly. And so Chris realizes, okay, what's going on here? Did she say something? Did he say something?
And so Chris kind of snaps out of his anxiety about the interview, and he looks at this guy and he's like, what's going on? Because again, this guy's just staring at his date. And this guy, sort of unprompted, without even looking at Chris, just begins insulting Chris's date. Insulting the way she looked, insulting the way she talked. And Chris is like, what's going on here? He's looking at his date like, did I miss something? Remember, he was sort of distracted a minute ago. But then eventually this guy, he says to Chris's date, you're an ugly pig. And at this, Chris is like, I can't just sit here. And so Chris, who had actually never been in a fight in his whole life, just sort of reflexively stood up and he was like, hey man, get up, like he's gonna fight him here. But as soon as he did that, Chris realized he had made a horrible mistake because Chris, he was only about 5'8" tall. And this guy, just the way he'd been sitting at the table, Chris hadn't really seen his full stature. And this guy, when he stood up, towered over Chris. But Chris, he was not a scared guy. He hadn't fought before, but he was defending his date's honor here. And he kind of looks up at this guy and he just kind of winds up and hits him once. But then this huge guy just proceeds to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the McDonald's. The next morning, Chris walked up to this big fancy building in London for his job interview. And Chris was doing his best to be confident, but it was really hard given the circumstances. So the previous night, after Chris had been battered by this total jerk, eventually the guy had stopped and stepped off of Chris, and Chris had gotten back up again, and the guy kind of wandered off and was not held to account in any way. He just kind of left the restaurant and vanished. But Chris, he got to his feet and he looked at his date and she was totally rattled by it. And Chris was super embarrassed at this point and he kept apologizing to his date and she's like, no, it's fine. And they just wanted to get out of there. And so they left the McDonald's and they both, went to their respective homes and Chris just went to bed. And then the next morning when Chris got up early because he has this big job interview, he went into the bathroom and he looked in the mirror and he saw he had this enormous black eye. But even though Chris understood that this very well could affect his chances of getting this job, they're gonna ask about his black eye, and what's he gonna say? Oh yeah, I got in a big fight at the McDonald's last night. There wasn't really a good excuse for it, and he wondered what they would think of him if he showed up looking like this ruffian, But he was like, you know what? This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had. I just gotta go in there, try to be confident, and don't let the black eye define the outcome. And so fast forward to later that morning, Chris goes into the building, he arrives for the interview, and before long he's having his interview, and he can tell they're all staring at his black eye, but nobody brought it up, which was sort of like worse in some ways. He almost wanted to be able to describe what happened, even though it didn't make him look good, but it was like the fact that they're staring at it and not acknowledging it, it really made him feel awkward. But, Chris did his best. He got through the interview, and by the end of it, he had no idea what the interviewers thought of him or what they thought of his ridiculous black eye, but he thanked them for the opportunity, and he left thinking, I'm not going to get the job. However, not long after this interview, Chris got some shocking news. He had gotten the job, and it actually might have been because of his black eye. Because this job interview was actually an audition for a starring role in an upcoming TV show. And the character that Chris was auditioning for was this guy who sort of got into fights. And so Chris rolls in here looking like a guy who gets into fights. And they're thinking, oh my goodness, he can hit his lines. He's got the charisma. And look at him. He's even a ruffian himself. He fits the character perfectly. He's our guy. So Chris got cast. And this TV show that he starred in became one of the most popular TV shows in the entire world. And so Chris went from being this guy who could barely afford a dinner at McDonald's to being this amazing actor who was getting nominated for Golden Globe Awards and Emmy Awards. He truly was an A-list star. Today, Chris is better known by his stage name, Kit Harington. And the starring role that he landed that changed his life was the role of Jon Snow in Game of Thrones.
I saw you cross the floor, diamonds on the tile, gold in your smile and trouble in your eyes. You spun me like a vow, then left me in the dust. I should've known it then, you're fire when you touch. Hold on, don't let me fall. You pull me close, then you take it off. Hold on, say my name slow. One little look and I won't let go.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.